Okay, class, continuing with the sympathetic nervous system, right? This is our fight or flight system, as we have mentioned earlier, right? Sympathetic chain ganglia is what we're going to talk about next. It's where most of the post-ganglionic cell bodies are found, right? Remember the sympathetic, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Sympathetic, short, preganglionic, long, postganglionic axon, right? So this sympathetic chain ganglia, as we see here, this chain right here, so we're talking about sympathetic chain ganglia. Where most of the postganglionic cell bodies are found. Remember, ganglia is just your cell bodies. Runs down parallel with the vertebral column. Looks like a chain where these postganglionic cell bodies. Remember the structure of the neuron: dendrite, cell body, axon. Right. Right. There's a section of the chain that extends above the thoracic spinal cord and terminates in the superior cervical ganglion, and section of the chain that extends below the lumbar spinal cord and terminates in the inferior sacral ganglion. Right? That's these chain ganglia. These are just a chain of postganglionic cell bodies. Runs parallel to the vertebral column. Right? This is all the sympathetic nervous system. The preganglionic neurons originate in the lateral horn. Remember the lateral horn of the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. Exit with axons of lower motor neurons via the anterior root. Remember, the autonomic nervous system is part of the motor. Remember, the motor comes out of the anterior root. Remember, sensory comes out of the posterior root, right? So just remember that. So the preganglionic neuron is going to originate in the lateral horn of the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. That's thoracic and lumbar spinal cord is where you have the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the most superior section in the brainstem, near the brainstem, is going to be parasympathetic, and also in the sacral section is parasympathetic. But in the thoracic and lumbar section, you have sympathetic. Okay, the preganglionic axons quickly separate from the spinal nerve anterior ramus to form a small nerve called white, means myelinated, rami communicantes, leads to the postganglionic cell bodies, which is in that chain, in the sympathetic chain ganglion. Right, so it's showing you that structure there. It's showing you the pathway that the signal is taking. Right, so the preganglionic neuron cell body is in your spinal cord somewhere. Okay, comes out of the anterior root. This is anterior, this is posterior for the purposes of this picture. And then it would synapse here with in this chain, sympathetic chain ganglion. So it connects with the spinal nerve, and it will come off the spinal nerve in the white, which is myelinated ramus communicans, synapse with a postganglionic neuron here, and then that axon would lead to the target cell, which in the autonomic nervous system is probably an organ or a gland. Okay. Some preganglionic axons pass through the chain ganglion without forming synapses. Right, we'll talk about those a little bit, and the term we call splenic nerves, which are preganglionic axons that synapse with the collateral ganglia near organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Right, we call those splanchnic nerves. Right, so there's a couple of these neurons the axons go through a little bit different pathway. All right, so just remember that. So looking at this picture here, sympathetic chain ganglia here. These are the postganglionic cell bodies here and here. Your preganglionic cell bodies are going to be in your spinal cord here. Okay. Most of them are going to go and synapse here, and then that's going to go to whatever structure they're trying to innervate. Some will pass through and synapse down the line, and then have axons of the postganglionic neurons there. So depending on different structures. So this is the Splanchnick's nerves, which will pass through this sympathetic chain ganglia and synapse closer to the structure. So 3 synapse locations are possible. Preganglionic axon can synapse postganglionic cell bodies in this chain ganglion, right? So it could synapse right here. So preganglionic, and then synapse, and then postganglionic. That's one choice. Preganglionic axon can ascend or descend to synapse with a postganglionic cell body and sympathetic chain ganglion at a different spinal cord level. So I don't see one here, but let's say if it came out here, preganglionic, and then moved up and synapsed up here. Okay, so here's some down here. So if it moved up and synapsed up here, and that's another way it could do it. And then it can pass through in synapse. We talked about the Splanchnick's. It can pass straight through the chain ganglia and synapse later on, which is at the collateral ganglia, next closer to the organ. Postganglionic axons exit the ganglia as small, gray, unmyelinated rami communicantes. Reunite and travel with the spinal nerves till they reach their target cells. Remember, nerves are just bundles of axons. So preganglionic, white, sends a quick signal. Postganglionic, gray. Okay, and it's just showing you the different pathways that it can take to get to the target cell. Neurotransmitters, right, in the sympathetic nervous system, right? Your neurotransmitters bind. Remember, you can send a signal electrically or chemically, right? Electrically, depolarize, 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 keep depolarizing. Chemically, depolarize, depolarize, release vesicles, neurotransmitters, which can increase or decrease the signal and cause the signal to be sent that way, right? So neurotransmitters convert that electrical signal into a chemical signal, which can then be transported, okay? So neurotransmitters bind to a specific protein-based receptor embedded in the plasma membranes of target cells. In the sympathetic nervous system, we have what they call, but we'll see this in different parts of the body, acetylcholine, right? Used to excite when it connects, when it's used in a synapse between the sympathetic preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, right? So it excites, it's a signal that will excite, and then the postganglionic axon then transmits this signal to the target cell. At the synapse with the target cell, the postganglionic axons release acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine. Epinephrine is very familiar, known as adrenaline. Okay? Noradrenaline, the norepinephrine, most frequently utilized neurotransmitter, released between the synapse, between the postganglionic axons and the target cells. So, right, so these are neurotransmitters that are released. So between the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, remember it's a two neuron system, acetylcholine is released. Between the postganglionic neuron and the target cell, which could be different structures depending on what it's targeting in the sympathetic nervous system. This is your fight or flight. It could be acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine. Right, so these neurotransmitters have to bind to specific receptors. Right, there's classes of sympathetic receptors, adrenergic receptors bind to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. You have alpha-1 receptors in the plasma membrane of smooth muscle cells. You have alpha-2 receptors in the plasma membranes of preganglionic sympathetic neurons, beta-1 receptors in your cardiac muscle cells, kidney cells, and adipose cells, beta-2 receptors, smooth muscle cells. So as you can see, the sympathetic nervous system can affect smooth muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, urinary bladder, skeletal muscles, respiratory tract, right? Adipose cells. You also have cholinergic receptors, which bind to acetylcholine. These are in your sweat glands in your skin, right? You start working hard, sweating. Nicotinic receptors, membranes of all postganglion neurons within the sympathetic ganglia and adrenal medulla. Right? You also have these alpha-2 receptors. These alpha-2 receptors differ from other adrenergic receptor subtypes. Right? Usually action potential in preganglionic neuron leads to acetylcholine release, stimulates postganglionic neuron. When norepinephrine binds to this alpha-2 receptor, however, the axon terminal is hyperpolarized and it slows or cancels the action potential. So these alpha-2 receptors have a little bit different response than the normal acetylcholine preganglionic receptors, which would normally stimulate the postganglionic neuron. All right, so this is a component of the negative feedback loop, it tells us, and preganglionic neuron activity is reduced or shut down to prevent excessive sympathetic output. All right, so here we have alpha-2 receptors, preganglionic neurons, norepinephrine bound to the alpha-2 receptor. So when alpha-2 receptors are not bound to norepinephrine, the preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, exciting the postganglionic neuron. When alpha-2 receptor binds norepinephrine, the preganglionic neuron hyperpolarizes, decreasing acetylcholine release, and thus reducing postganglionic neuron activity. So you can reduce, so these receptors can help slow down the sympathetic pathway. Now, effects of the SNS on target cells, sympathetic nervous system on target cells. Right, so your fight or flight, directed at survival and maintenance of homeostasis during time of physical or emotional stress, right? So think about, as we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, we break it down into the parasympathetic, the rest and digest, the sympathetic, the fight or flight, right? And so the fight or flight is, remember I said, we haven't gotten to the slide here yet, but I said it's not like one completely cuts off and the other one, but one sort of takes control and the other one is lesser, where so when you're in fight or flight, the sympathetic is more in control. When you're in rest and digest, the parasympathetic is more in control, right? But they're both working at all times, right? So when you were in physical or emotional stress, you're working out at the gym, you're moving boxes from your apartment to your new house, you're under emotional stress because you haven't seen your professor in a couple of days and you miss them and you're stressed out and you're like, what am I going to do? I I got to see my professor so you can teach me some more anatomy and physiology. So the sympathetic nervous system, what effect does it have? Like when it's in control, when you're in fight or flight, when you're in physical or emotional stress, what does the sympathetic nervous system do? Right? So we talked about the neurotransmitters that are released by the sympathetic nervous system, and we know that acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine can be released onto the target cell. So what happens? What this is where we want to get to. Okay, we've talked about the pathway, the preganglionic, short axon, postganglionic, long axon, the chain ganglia, the thoracic and lumbar section of the spinal cord. We've talked about all of that now, but what does it do? All right, so what is the effect is what we really want to get to. We're going to discuss this also with the parasympathetic. All right, so the effect on cardiac muscle cells. So norepinephrine binds to beta-1 receptors, causing the following changes. Raises both your rate and force of contraction. Increase your heart rate. That means more blood is being pumped. Increase the force of a contraction. More blood being pumped per pump, right? So more blood coming through your body, more oxygen getting to the tissues and the organs in your body, right? So if I'm running on a treadmill, my muscles need more oxygen, right? My heart beats faster. My heart pumps harder, right? So more blood gets to my muscles to be able to keep up with the fact that I am stressing them by, running on the treadmill. Amount of blood delivered to tissues, blood pressure both increase, right? Effect on smooth muscle cells, right? So norepinephrine, which is released by the postganglionic neuron, right? Constriction of blood vessels, serving the digestive, urinary, and tegumentary systems, right? They are not as important when you're in fight or flight mode, right? Your body is, when you're in fight or flight mode, digestion is a slow and the process that happens when you're resting. The urinary system, the integumentary system, these things aren't as necessary when you're in fight or flight mode, when you're emotional stress or physical stress. So we constrict the amount of blood going to the digestive, the urinary, and the integumentary system, decrease blood flow to those organs. Okay? Dilation of bronchioles, right? Increase the amount of air that can be inhaled. If I'm running on the treadmill, I need more oxygen, so more air needs to go in. Dilation of blood vessels. Blood vessels to my skeletal and cardiac muscles, those blood vessels dilate. More blood can get to my skeletal muscles because I'm using my muscles, whether I'm running or whatever I'm doing, and my cardiac muscle because my heart needs to pump harder. So the heart needs blood too to be able to function. Increase that blood flow. Contraction of urinary and digestive sphincters. All right, so emptying bladder and bowel movements are more difficult when you have in physical activity, right? So if you are your body's exercising, you're working hard, you're focused on going to the bathroom so much, right? So it makes those harder to happen, right? Contraction of your urinary and digestive sphincters. So you can't do number one or number two. I mean, you can, but it makes it so that your body is not, at that time, not designed to do that. Let's just put it that way. All right. Effects on smooth muscle, right? So we slow the digestive process. Digestive process is not necessary right now, right? We're going to just use quick energy, the energy we already have. Allow more light into the eye, dilation of the pupils, right? When you're scared, when you're running, when you're in go mode, your eyes get bigger, right? More light goes into your eyes. Decrease constriction of blood vessels serving most exocrine glands, right? Decrease secretion, right? Except for your sweat glands. So things like your salivary glands, that have secretions that you can start the digestion of food when you start to eat it. You decrease that when you're in fight or flight mode, because you're not focused on eating or digesting food, okay? But sweat glands are the only glands that increase when you're in fight or flight. All right, effective secretion from sweat glands attempts to maintain body temperature during periods of increased physical activity. So that's one way that you know you're using your sympathetic nervous system. If you're doing something that's causing you to sweat, you're using your sympathetic nervous system. Okay, you're in fight or flight mode. Right, you're physically or emotionally stressed. Right, not just if you're sweating because of hot temperature. We're talking about if you're sweating because of some kind of physical activity or emotional feeling, like you taking a midterm exam and all of a sudden you start sweating. That's your sympathetic nervous system. Causes that exocrine gland to work and to increase when you're in fight or flight mode. Right. There's also some effects on cellular metabolism. So your skeletal muscle is going to require more ATP because it's doing more work. So beta-3 receptors of the adipocytes triggers breakdown of lipids. So when you're in sympathetic nervous system, your body breaks down lipids. Lipids release fatty acids into the bloodstream. That's energy. Beta-2 receptors on the liver cells release glucose from glycogen. Remember, your liver can stores glucose in the form of glycogen, which is chains of glucose molecules. Right? Release that glucose. That's quick energy. This is why we don't necessarily need, if your body does not try to digest new food, it breaks down the fat that's in the body and breaks down, releases glucose that's already in the body and uses that as energy right now. It's not trying to digest and pull nutrients from food, because that's a slow process. It just uses the energy it already has, right? And triggers a release of glucagon, which in beta-2 receptors on the pancreas triggers a release of the hormone glucagon, which increases your blood glucose levels. Okay, so glucose levels go up. Glucose is released from glucose in the form of glycogen is released from your liver. Breakdown of lipids, so you have energy available. So you have to be able to make ATP, to be able to supply the muscles that are under this physical or emotional stress, right? And that's some of the effects of your sympathetic nervous system. Pupils dilate, heart beats faster, more blood to the heart, lungs, bronchioles dilate, more oxygen in, less blood to the digestive system, less blood to the urinary system, less blood to the integumentary system, we increase sweat, increase skeletal muscular function, increase your ATP, increase your energy levels, right? Sympathetic nervous system. Effects on the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla sits on top of each of the kidneys, which we talk about when you get to chapter 24 and when we get to the urinary system, which is in part 2 of this class, anatomy and physiology part 2, right? So when you get to the medulla, which is composed of modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons, acetylcholine is released from the preganglionic neurons, binds to the nicotinic receptors on the adrenal medulla, stimulates medullary cells to release norepinephrine and epinephrine to the bloodstream. So it sort of acts similar. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get into the endocrine system. So when it releases the norepinephrine and epinephrine to the bloodstream, it's not as a neurotransmitter, it's released to the bloodstream. Now it's called a hormone, and this acts as a long-distance chemical messenger. All right, so this is an interface between the endocrine and the nervous system, right? So this is, when they say you're an adrenaline junkie, right? So the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the medulla, which is on top of the kidney, and when we go through the urinary system in part 2 of this class, you realize that a quarter of your blood passes through your kidneys every minute. So a lot of blood is going through your kidneys. So your kidneys are in close contact with your bloodstream. And this the adrenal medulla, when it's stimulated, releases this norepinephrine and epinephrine right into the bloodstream, not directly affecting a target cell, but directly into the bloodstream. And when you release a neurotransmitter, release those neurotransmitters into the bloodstream, now we call those hormones, and they can affect different parts of the body. And that's when you're like feeding off of adrenaline junkie. It's in your blood. You feed it, right? And so that's just showing you the preganglionic neuron with its cell body in the soma cell body in the spinal cord. Axon goes to the adrenal medulla, which is a collection of postganglionic cell bodies, which will release norepinephrine and epinephrine directly into the bloodstream. All right, and some effects on some other cells. Enhances mental alertness. Is of this really the one I want you to get off of this page, right? You're more mentally alert. You ever have people say, well, you know, they were scared or something, or you know, something was happening, and it's like the world, like everything's slowed down. You'll hear athletes say this a lot. You know, last second shot, you know, 3, 2, 1, you know, and they say it felt like everything slowed down. It's because your mind is firing and you're paying attention to so many things at once. It almost seems like everything slowed down. 3, 2, 1, and swish. Ah! And then all of a sudden, you know, the pressure is off when you make the shot, and it's just celebration. It's like everything gets back to normal again because you're excited and you're happy, but you're not in that you know, high adrenaline sympathetic pathway anymore. After you know, you can sort of relax once the shot goes in and just celebrate. But yeah, that mental alertness is caused by the increased neuron activity in the cerebral cortex due to your sympathetic nervous system. Also, you have an increase in muscle tension. You know, you have people who will get strong when adrenaline is rushing through the body. I remember I was holding my daughter once, and I put her in the water, and it was too hot, and she leaped out of my arm. And it was just like, you know, for a moment there, you know, she was only 4 years old, but she was stronger, physically felt stronger than me, even though I'm, you know, 185 pounds, and she's like, you know, 30 something pounds or whatever she is, you know, but she physically like came out of my grip because, you know, her adrenaline spiked, the water was hot, and her body just, I was like, whoa. So yeah, so you have these, you know, this is how our body is designed, you know, designed to, you know, when you're in this fight or flight mode, your body's in protection mode, right? So you'll find like you get your muscle strength temporarily increases. We haven't talked about the muscular system too much in this class yet, but that's just something that's a response of your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight mode. A few more slides. This is just some more information. Most drugs targeting the sympathetic nervous system work in one of two ways. Antagonists block receptors, prevent norepinephrine binding to it, and agonists bind receptor and mimic effects of norepinephrine, right? And these are some common drugs. You have some alpha-1 blockers. You can treat, for instance, you can treat hypertension. You can treat hyperplasia used with these different blockers that can block the receptors in the sympathetic nervous system. Right, you can just go through that on your own. That's not something I'm going to test you on, but you can go through that on your own. Okay, but there is one good one here is asthma. My son has asthma, so beta-2 receptors on smooth muscles or bronchioles cause bronchodilation, right? So for someone who has asthma and they have bronchial constriction, they give them this beta 2 agonist, which basically acts like the norepinephrine and sort of puts the lungs in what would be the fight or flight mode and causes them to dilate. And that's used to treat asthma. So just things like that are interesting. Interesting fun facts. And then there's weight loss, which is always fun. And this is also just a fun fact, not something that you need to memorize. But obviously, when you're in the sympathetic nervous system, you're burning more calories, right? If you have burning the fat, you're releasing the glucose. So if I can get you in that sympathetic, in that fight or flight mode more often, which your body is in when you are exercising, but if I can get you in that, if I can keep your body in that fight or flight sympathetic mode more often, you'll burn more fat, right? So that's kind of like an idea of these, some of these metabolic fat burners, which increase your metabolism. And they're trying to trick the body into being, some of them are trying to trick the body into being in fight or flight in that sympathetic nervous system mode, which thus increases your metabolism and causes your body to release fat, burn more fat, release more glucose, to try to do that. You'll find sometimes that people who take some of these like hydroxycut medications, things like, supplements or whatever they are, will have like an increased heart rate and things like that. So they're not necessarily healthy for you. So be careful with those because they can elevate your heart rate, cause seizures, high blood pressure, and kidney failure. So be very careful with some of these sort of metabolism increasing drugs or fat burners, as they call them. Okay.